We'll start taking questions in a few minutes, and we have a circulating mic. I'm not sure if Elena or somebody's able to circulate with it. I wanted to take sort of chair's liberty to ask a first question to get the dialogue going, and I'll encourage you all to get on Twitter if you haven't already to ask the questions as well. I think I've said my point. The question that I wanted to ask, which I thought echoed through all three presentations, is around engagement on this issue. And there's a particular kind of engagement that I'm curious about your thoughts on. And that is with respect to the issue of violence, whether it be interpersonal or nuclear. I sense that younger generations are not nearly as engaged on this issue as older generations perhaps were. And whether that be that they didn't have a parent who fought in World War II or themselves had fought in World War II, or whether that be that they had not experienced, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I worry that with respect to violence and peace, this isn't an issue sufficiently on the agenda of the young people, the next generation perhaps. And I don't normally like to give away my age, but I was actually born 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall fell. And so I only lived through 2 weeks of the Cold War. And I'd be interested in knowing from the audience who here was born since 1989. Could you put up your hands? So we have a large proportion of the audience out there that has never really lived in the fear of nuclear war in the same way, and that perhaps did not feel violence in the same way. And so I'm wondering if you could each take a moment to speak to the issue of engaging this next generation on this very important subject.
Well, I think with regards to the question of nuclear war prevention, this clearly is an issue. The generation that grew up after the end of the Cold War really did not have this sort of seminal experience that those of us who lived through the Cold War did, of being terrified that our world would be destroyed in a nuclear war. It informed our lives very deeply during that time, and the memories have lingered on even where the understanding of nuclear war has sort of passed out of our everyday thinking. There's sort of a reservoir there that can be drawn on. When we do educational work now to people who lived through the Cold War, you can see that what we're telling people is resonating with what they remember from the past. With regards to some other kind of violence, I'm not sure it's as big an issue. I mean, in the States, there's been very large youth participation in the Black Lives Matter movement. And the difference, I think, has just been this has been in the news. It's been part of the culture, whereas nuclear war hasn't. But those would be my thoughts.
I think there are a number of different issues. One is the construction of certainly when we look at the issue of gun violence, one issue is clearly the construction of it. This is the first time I've ever done a poll in the last 25 years where young people were less supportive of gun control than older people. And that has never been the case before. Some of it, I think, is awareness, because people born after 1989 may know their parents commemorate December 6th, etc. But there's a generation of us for whom, at least in this country, December 6th was profoundly impactful in the United States. The assassination of JFK, Columbine, you name it. There have been enough high-profile incidents that have engaged people. But on gun violence, we see the support group really aging. And so we've been trying to get young people to engage other young people, because that's, I think, really the only way to construct campaigns and so on that resonate with them. I think one of the most challenging issues is, and I mentioned this earlier today, we do see young people engaged in protest campaigns, Black Lives Matter and so on. That doesn't necessarily translate into political influence. And that's why I mentioned my experience with the Amnesty International meeting, because it's great to go and protest. But if you don't know the name of your member of parliament, the chances of you actually having any real impact are pretty limited. And having studied social movements and looking at the evidence of social innovation processes that have worked and many that haven't, it does seem to me that you have to understand power, how it's exercised, policy-making processes, and how they're influenced. And frankly, there's very little evidence in this country, or certainly in the United States, that kind of public engagement actually translates into policy.
So I think there are some reasons for optimism. You know, the political headlines in the States have rather been dominated by the Trump campaign, but you know, I think in some ways the bigger story is the remarkable ascendancy of Bernie Sanders. But honestly, for somebody who's a self-declared socialist to run a political establishment figure so very close for the Democratic nomination is quite extraordinary, and I would not have predicted that. I think the remarkable thing about his campaign is the way in which it has galvanized young people to come out and again get interested in politics and to support him. And I think that's a reason to be optimism. Jeremy Corbyn's election as the leader of the Labour Party in the UK was similarly driven by young people. And he's the most remarkable example of all. Nicola Sturgeon, who was the First Minister of Scotland, in the general election of a couple of years ago, won 56 of 59 Westminster seats. Absolutely unprecedented. She's just been re-elected again with an overwhelming result in the Scottish Parliament. She is in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament. Not only is she personally in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament, it is and always has been one of the main planks of the policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party. And they have the nuclear Faslane Trident base in Scotland, which houses all of the UK nuclear Trident submarines. Why does that example matter? That example matters because somebody who takes a courageous and principled stance is still electable and re-electable and can win extraordinary majorities. So I think there's some reasons for optimism out there. I do think that, as my colleagues have hinted in their talks and said more explicitly since, that one needs to be conscious and deliberate about this. I'm reminded of a statement by one of the US presidents in the past who said that within every politician is a statesman fighting to get out. And I think our job is to help politicians find their inner statesman. It's not easy. Their life is not easy. I don't envy them their life. But I do think our job doesn't stop with producing papers or advocating positions. I think we actually have to get our hands dirty and engage with politicians and help them do the right thing.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, so we'll take 2 questions at a time because I'm sure there are a lot for this wonderful group of panelists, and we'll address them for a couple minutes and then move on. We have about 15 minutes. So first question I see is just over there. If we could go over there with the microphone, and just keep your hand up if you have any questions. Or feel free to come in via Twitter as well, which I'm already seeing some questions come in that way. Okay.
I wanted to address what was just said about the Black Lives Matter movement, because I feel that what you said was quite dismissive of the impact of that movement. And I think that while we have not seen huge policy changes yet out of the Black Lives Matter movement, what we have seen are indictments being brought down against police officers, which we had not seen in the past. I should say, by the way, that I'm from the United States. So I'm coming from my context. And I can't make this microphone work. But in addition, we've seen police officers complaining that they are now afraid to draw their weapons, which is great. We have seen effects of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think that it is off base to say to young people, particularly young people of color, who have good reason to feel that their voices are not heard in the democratic process, that their efforts working outside of that are invalid simply because they have chosen a different tactic to make their voices heard.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that was just back here at this table. I think there was two at this table, so I'm not sure who was first there, but go for it.
Ok, merci. Je vais poser la question en français.
Okay, I will translate for you. That's okay.
La vaccination, elle est gratuite, telle qu'on la pratique. Pas seulement elle est gratuite, elle n'est pas contraignante. Donc, elle n'est pas obligatoire. On ne contraint pas, on n'oblige pas. Tout ce qui est gratuit est avilissant. Tout ce qui est gratuit plaide à ce qu'on puisse douter de ça. Pourquoi on doit continuer cette pratique? Je suppose, avec quelqu'un qui a un peu d'expérience, je suis en train de marquer une ligne. Supposez qu'au moment de la vaccination, on mettait 2 centres de santé. Un qui va pratiquer gratuité et l'autre, la maman, va payer sa vaccination. Qu'est-ce qu'on verrait? Pourquoi l'OMS ne veut pas changer? Merci.
Thank you. That's okay, everyone?
Nah.
Okay.
Okay.
No, that's okay. No, I was going to translate for you. That's okay. I was just seeing how our panelists' French was, but not expecting any. That's okay. So we have 2 questions. We'll take those and then move along. So the second question was around vaccination. Vaccination is free. And I think the essence of it was if we were to draw a line and have vaccination free or paid, not free, how would we see vaccination rates perhaps change? And I'm not sure whether that was also then tied to the comment that Dr. Donnelly had made regarding parenting, but you had also mentioned around the fact that vaccination is not necessarily required or obligatory. Did I capture that okay, or was there any other aspects?
Related to that picture.
Yes. Yes. Perfect. So perhaps the first question, Wendy, would you like to address that first?
Sure. I mean, I'm Canadian. I'm talking about protest movements in Canada, and there's very little impact of the evidence is pretty clear that it isn't translated into anything measurable, whether we're talking about carding practices by the police here and so on. It's great if it's having an impact in the United States, but I do believe that if you're not engaged with political processes, your ability to shape policy is limited, and we can debate that. I wouldn't say that my intention was to dismiss the importance of people expressing their concerns, but from my perspective, in terms of the issues that I work on, we need people who are politically engaged with the political process, shaping legislation.
Okay. And then in terms of the second question, I wonder perhaps commenting around, Peter, perhaps around strategies that one might use to start addressing parenting, perhaps more like the issue of vaccination, if that's an okay interpretation of the question. How might we get it more on the public health agenda and get people thinking about it in that sort of important way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important issue to raise. around the fact that something's free and not free. And of course, one of the problems with childcare is that it can be very expensive and a huge drain on the resources of poorer families. I wasn't sure I entirely understood the question, which I think is partly my not very good French, and partly just the sound quality wasn't great. So I'm not sure. Forgive me if I'm missing the point. I'll happily have a discussion with you afterwards and try and answer your question. What I would say about the vaccination analogy is that it's just something I'm testing out, and I'm really keen to have people's reaction. The bigger point is that I don't think it's good enough just to say, well, we do our bit and we know what's the right thing to do, and if only politicians would just do their bit. I really do think we need to engage and try and find a way to help them do the right thing, and to try and help them do the thing which, frankly, many of them would like to do. I've worked with politicians for many, many years, of all political persuasion, and I have to tell you that contrary to the popular myth, the vast majority of politicians go into that way of life with good intentions. You know, they really in Western countries do not go into it because they're seeking a lot of money, or because they somehow think that this is a great lifestyle. Their lifestyles are lousy. It's a terrible job. I mean, how many of us face the possibility of being flung out of our job every 4 or 5 years? Face the possibility of our slightest little personal life peccadillo appearing on the front page of every newspaper. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think it behoves us all to try and work with elected politicians. If we believe in democracy, which we should, it behoves us all to try and work with them to help them do the right thing, because they don't have an easy job.
Thank you, Peter. And as a public health doctor in training, I guess my only concern with the analogy is the increasing spread of parenting hesitancy. And perhaps that's related to vaccine hesitancy, but that's not the subject of this plenary. There's 2 questions that have come in via Twitter, and I just wanted to pose them in, and I know Wendy wanted to add something, so I'm going to pose these questions, and if you want to contribute to these as well. One is surrounding the issue of what about targeting gun production as a means of gun control? And the second question, perhaps more directed at Peter, was what are the transgenerational effects of bad parenting? So I'll Ira, is there anything you wanted to add before Wendy? I know you want to. Okay. And Wendy, I know you want to make a point.
Just on the free vaccination analogy, one of the things that's very clear from the empirical data I've seen is that subsidized childcare in Quebec has a profound impact on the resilience of children, and it has ripple effects on just about all health-related outcomes in the province, except perhaps smoking, not so sure. But that's a really interesting example just within the Canadian context, where we can see huge impact, I think, from subsidizing childcare and early childhood education. And what's important about that is its impact not just on the support that children receive, but the impact it then has on the ability of women to engage in the workforce, and so on and so on and so on. So the complexity of some of these issues, I think, as we discussed earlier, is hard to unpack, but I would argue that that's one of the levers that has a profound impact, even more so than many of the broader public policy issues that are often discussed in this context.
Thank you.
On the gun production thing, the problem goes back to what I said at the outset, which is that because most countries view firearms and small arms as having legitimate purposes, although they define those in a variety of ways, prohibiting the production is not likely to be supported or effective. So in most contexts, it's really a regulatory model that people are exploring. And the problem with that is it becomes much more complicated. I've often thought it would have been far easier to run a campaign calling for a ban on handguns, for example, in Canada, even if it had been less effective in terms of reducing gun death and injury.
And there is just the question of transgenerational parenting, but in the interest of time, because we only have about 5 more minutes at most to finish the plenary, and I'm sure there's lots more questions, I'd like to take several more questions from the audience, and then we'll give each panelist about 90 seconds to respond to those that they wish to speak to. And please, when you're asking your question, make it a question, and if it runs over about 15 or 20 seconds, we'll have to turn off the microphone on you. So I see a question right there.
This question goes to all 3 panelists. Considering how deeply enmeshed violence and gun control and the nuclear issue is with our economies, what are some of the more creative things that you have heard about? And Dr. Donnelly, I'm very happy to see some of the creative elements there to try to make up for the potential loss in the economy, for loss of handgun jobs, for loss of nuclear armament types of workforce. As the old saying goes, it's very hard to make someone understand something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it.
Thank you. Next question. Oh, here. Please, go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
So I'm Dorothy Golden Rosenberg, and I teach about environmental and ecosystem health to graduate students at U of T. A couple of points. Ira, this morning I mentioned, and after seeing your presentation now, I mentioned reviving the film If You Love This Planet with Helen Caldicott on nuclear war. It's a National Film Board film. I believe it's online. And Ira, after you showed this nuclear scenario with New York for Canadians, what do you think that we could do to revive for all of our social movements for peace? That's the question to you.
Thank you.
Wendy, I just wanted to mention that I think that the climate change movement is having an effect on politicians. They're meeting with them, they're talking with them. We're seeing some results in some cases. So pipelines, tar sands, etc. I think there are some things happening. And there are mostly young people who are working. So I'd like your comments on that. And Peter, I wanted to ask you, I agree with you completely about parenting. I'm a parent and a grandparent myself. But I teach about environmental health, and we also talk about neurotoxins and the effect on the development of the child. And Barbara McKelgan of the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada has shown in her research that the issues around the learning disabilities lead to a lot of behavioral problems in the future.
Thank you. Well done. That was very impressive. 3 questions. Any other questions from the audience? And then we'll close things off. So we have 2 quick ones right here in the center.
Thank you. I'm struggling to frame this question, but it relates to North Korea and where you might put that, Ira, on a spectrum of risk related to nuclear weapons use.
Thank you. And in the center here, is it Michael?
As a family physician and a father, I've always thought it was crazy how society gives everybody a license to drive and a license to have a dog, but no license to have children. And we know that our parenting education comes from our own parents, and they necessarily did a very good job, in my case being an exception, of course. But
thanks.
My question is, what do you think of the idea, anybody in the panel, but Dr. Donnelly specifically, the concept of when you get married and you get a license, those of you who wish to have parents, get a 50-hour training course before they decide to have their children, and that could be culturally specific in cultural languages, and the people within that culture could run the courses with sociologists, psychologists, wonderful parents, and have a very rich preventative program.
Thanks. All right, and that's all the questions we'll be able to take for now. We'll have some more time for some dialogue afterwards. So I'll hand it over to the panelists, and if you each wanted to sort of make closing remarks for more like 60 seconds now, that'd be great.
North Korea, very scary, not the biggest problem. Biggest problem is the United States and Russia. But North Korea is a problem too. Reviving films, If You Love This Planet is a great film. It's a bit dated, but it'd be very powerful to get it in circulation again. I think we need to make some new films. I think we need a film about limited nuclear war that helps people understand that even a very small war will destroy modern civilization. And whatever we can do to encourage that would be good. And then on the question of the economic loss, with regards to nuclear weapons, fortunately, this is a very small portion of the economy. This is not like climate change, where the things we need to do affect enormous segments of the economy. It's a very small section of the economy that is involved in the production of nuclear weapons, and I think we just have to make the correct decision and figure out how to be supportive of people who will lose their jobs.
I said this earlier today, education's the least effective way to change behavior, and we know from injury prevention that economic interventions, enforcement, and certainly engineering initiatives have more impact. So when I apply that in the context of parenting, families, and so on, what worries me about putting too much focus on education, of course awareness can help, is if you don't have the structural supports in place, you really run the risk of introducing all kinds of bias around socioeconomic backgrounds, privilege, and so on. And I really do think that what's required more than anything is really good supports for families, particularly those who are at risk. And just jumping off that, the same thing is true with political change. We know that driving political change requires multi-layered interventions. So if you don't have a political strategy that really looks at who exercises power, what do they respond to, and how do you influence them, I fear that you will not be effective. So I think the two things are related.
Thank you, Wendy. And we'll save the last word there for you, Peter.
So lots of good questions, and not possible to do them justice in 60 seconds. But let me try and say something that might somewhat address all of them to a certain degree. I referred earlier on in my talk earlier in the day to Martin Luther King, and one of the things he said was that we should always remember the importance of the shadow cast by that which we cannot see. The shadow cast by that which we cannot see. And of course he had in mind the very long-term consequences of slavery. But you could apply it to many other things. So the great trade unionist Jimmy Reid in Scotland would probably have used a somewhat similar expression to affect the intergenerational devastation brought about by the end of the shipbuilding industry on the west coast of Scotland. And we can think of other examples closer to home here in Canada where things done in the recent past are still creating echoes. Now, whether those effects are transmitted by social circumstances, by the devastation of culture, or perhaps even to a certain extent through epigenetics, who knows? But I think it really is important that whatever our training, we think about Martin Luther King's shadow. We think about the shadow of the things unseen. So I may be an epidemiologist by training, but I'm a historian by inclination, and I think that's a useful combination.
Thank you, Peter. And so just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Over the next hour and a half or so, before our gala dinner and our exciting keynote speaker and music begin, there's 3 sessions that'll be happening simultaneously. In the Cortland room will be a re-showing, you can consult the program, but there'll be a re-showing of the film from lunchtime. There'll also be a encore of Nikki Shaw and Natalie Downs' presentations on nuclear war in Macintosh. And there's going to be 2 student young professional sessions. The one by Erica will be in the Spartan room, and by Ann Anderman will be in the Northern Spy room. So you can consult the programs, but lots of exciting stuff going on before our exciting evening. And so this brings this session to a close. I think the action-packed and felt like we were constantly running out of time is just indicative of how impressive and how inspiring the speakers here this evening have been, and how engaging you've been as audience. So thank you all for that, and thanks for being here.